I'm Kent Brower. I'm the Senior Research Fellow in Biblical Studies at Nazarene Theological College, Manchester, and the Director of Research at the college. I've had a long-standing interest in Mark ever since I came to Manchester years ago to complete my PhD at the university on the Old Testament in the Markan Passion narrative. But since then, I've continued my interest in Mark as well, both in teaching and in writing, and even in preaching occasionally on the Gospel of Mark. So it's been a joy to be dealing with this inspiring document. And every time I look at it, it continues to bring me joy and excitement because it is so inspiring and indeed inspired. Mark is thought to be the earliest of the Gospels, partly because the other two synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, seem to use Mark's sequence quite often. John is a little bit different, but the connection between these two is still the subject of investigation by scholars over the years. Arguments have gone to and fro about the relationship between the Gospels themselves. My interest, however, is not particularly dealing with that. I'm looking much more at Mark as a document itself, as a narrative telling us the story of Jesus. Mark is written in Greek, of course. Some scholars think that it isn't very polished Greek, that Mark's Greek is rough and ready. Be that as it may, I'm not convinced of that, but what do I know? My first language is English, not Greek. So it does have a style to it, which seems to be very clear. It has a breathlessness about it, a way he's writing the narrative, which is quite polished in many ways. And also we have this question about who is Mark? Well, we have several alternatives for that. In the New Testament, we have a John Mark, mentioned on several occasions. He's a companion of Paul. Seems to be a companion of Peter. The early church has some things to say about that. I discuss some of these questions in my first chapter, or my first discussion with you in the Bible Month booklet. But I'm more interested in trying to figure out who the implied author of Mark is. And that is the author as the author emerges from the text itself. What does Mark's narrative tell us about who Mark is? We can look at things like the fact that Mark seems to be familiar with the Old Testament. He knows the echoes of the Old Testament. He's clearly a believer in Jesus, the Messiah, Son of God. He may well have been a proclaimer of the word somewhere. He seems to be a very skilled author, despite what I just said a moment ago about some people's argument about the unpolished Greek. He uses the literary tools of the day. For example, Mark is brilliant at devising pictures of the characters in the gospel, even to the point at one occasion when the woman with the 12-year gynecological disorder actually is given voice. We hear what she's thinking inside. So Mark has made her into more than a flat character on the screen. Or Mark, we can see how he uses sequence to describe events in a way that then conveys energy and motion. You will remember, for example, that Mark has the confession of Jesus as the Messiah in Caesarea Philippi, which is at the furthest northern extent of his ministry, you could argue. And he then moves him all the way down to Jericho. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. So sequence placement is all important, I think, for Mark's gospel. What he selects to include and how he shapes the stories he tells is also an indication of his skill. And we begin to learn more about who Mark is, this implied author of Mark, and his implied audience, who he's writing to, as we listen carefully to the text itself. One of the things I like to do as a consequence of that is when I'm reading through the gospel, and I come upon something which I find strange or odd, I want to ask myself the question, why does Mark have this here? What's his reason for putting this particularly in this place? Or why has he written the story this way? What is he trying to convey to me, his second generation reader, as it were? And what's he conveying to his first generation reader, whom he will know lives in the ancient Greco-Roman world? What's he doing with all this? And I think asking that question quite often is important. But I think overall, the most important thing that I could say about how we look at Mark is we look at it as a narrative as a whole. A generation ago, scholars used to look at small sections of the gospel and analyze them in detail as if they were disconnected and didn't fit into anything important. And Mark, one scholar, once talked about it as collecting pearls up on a string. I don't think that's Mark. Mark has a nice narrative, a story that starts in place and runs all the way through to an end. It's a short story. It only details a year of Jesus' life, but it's a story nevertheless, and we need to hear what Mark is trying to convey, both theologically and biographically, about Jesus and the disciples. I think what we've missed frequently is the theological emphasis in Mark's gospel, and that's what I hope we can pick up a little bit in our discussion together. So one of the questions we had to face was, how were we going to divide Mark into 4 lessons? I think we've come up with a fairly good division. Mark, you might know, has a watershed moment in the middle of the gospel. And so you could say that the gospel is a game of 2 halves, the first half and the second half. That watershed moment is the confession of Peter to Jesus, that Jesus is the Messiah. But before that, we have then to divide this first half into 2 parts as well. And what I've chosen to do is start out with chapter 1 and end at the end of chapter 3. So chapter 1 to the end of 3 is a question of Jesus' gradual unveiling of his identity. We find out that Jesus first, according to Mark, tells us right from the start that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And then Jesus hears the voice from heaven saying that you are my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. But for the disciples, this identity is gradually unveiled. Alongside with the unveiling of Jesus' identity is the calling of the disciples to follow Jesus, to be shaped themselves into the holy people of God centered around Jesus. And I talk a little bit about that in the first lesson, how that happens. It's a strange lot, isn't it? Because tax collectors and sinners are coming to Jesus and he's bringing them into his people. The 12 apostles, interesting group of people there as well. And those who followed Jesus along the way, really interesting group of people as well. We learned at the end of the gospel that many people had followed him all the way from Galilee. This section comes to a conclusion when Jesus' family is outside, worried about Jesus because they think he's getting outside of himself, going to cause some problems. The whole story has, at this point, has had people who should have understood who Jesus is near to him, gradually moving away, scribes, Pharisees, and so on, gradually moving away, so that, and including his family, so that now they are outside. And Jesus' family comes to him and says, Jesus, we need you to come home. And someone reports to him that your mothers and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And Jesus says, who is my mother, my brother and sisters? And looking around at those who are seated next to him, he says, whoever does the will of God is my mother, brother, sisters. The new identity of Jesus' family is a critical point. My next chapter dealt with the first parable, when Jesus is sowing the seed, where Jesus has a sower going to sow the seed, an explanation of that, and concludes with a final boat ride on the journey with the disciples. In the middle of this, we have several really interesting episodes. We have Jesus walking on water. We have Jesus calming the sea. We have Jesus feeding the 4,000. We have Jesus feeding the 5,000. We have Jesus healing Legion. We have Jesus restoring a life to a 12-year-old girl. We have Jesus healing a woman who has been carrying a gynecological disorder for 12 years. We have so many things going on, including Jesus healing people outside of his own territory. The disciples are with Jesus in all this time. They are actually assisting Jesus in feeding the 5,000 and feeding the 4,000. And we come to this end of the section, and they're on the final boat ride. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, you need to be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Watch out for that. And they're on this journey across the sea, and the disciples are anxious. They are saying, I wonder what he's on about. Does he know that we only brought one loaf? I bet he's worried about the fact that we don't have enough to eat on this journey. And Jesus picks up what they're talking about amongst themselves, and he says to them, are you worried about the fact that we don't have any bread? Really? Seriously? You were with me when we fed the 5,000 and the 4,000. How much was left over? And you're asking the question about bread? Are you blind? Are your ears not hearing? Are your hearts hardened like the enemies that I have? And that's where this section ends. Really interesting ending. Right next to that, we have one of these sections where I ask, why has Mark put this here? Here's the story of Jesus healing a person in two goes, a blind person in two goes. He sees things, but he doesn't see them clearly yet. So it's a two-stage healing. Why? And we ask this question. Now, I think there's an answer. We'll find that. My third chapter is starting at chapter 8, beginning with the confession. Here, Peter is asked the question, who do people say that I am? The disciples are asked it too. And Peter responds by saying, well, you are the Messiah. The penny has dropped. And Jesus immediately tells them, here's the kind of Messiah I am. I'm a suffering Son of Man kind of Messiah. And Peter is not pleased. And the disciples are not pleased. And then Jesus says to them, not only is this the kind of Messiah I am, but if anyone wants to come after me, they must take up their cross and follow me. There's a shock. They get who he is, but they don't know what it means either for Jesus, and they certainly don't know what it means for themselves. Do they see, but only see partially? Interesting connection, isn't there? Then we have this whole series of teachings that goes on that I talk about in the third section of our discussion, that concludes with the second healing of a blind person, blind Bartimaeus, on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. Here, Bartimaeus sees clearly and joins Jesus on the way. Between these two blind healing episodes, Jesus is teaching his disciples on this journey from Caesarea Philippi in the north all the way south to Jericho as they get ready to go to Jerusalem. So we have a geographical and a theological journey that Jesus is making with the disciples. My final chapter was probably the most condensed, and I had to miss most of it, most of the good things there, because it's dealing with the passion narrative all the way from chapter 11 to chapter 16, verse 8. Here we have Jesus starting out in the temple, teaching. We have Jesus talking about the fate of the temple because it's refused to accept who he is. We then have the passion narrative where we have things like the institution of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus at the Last Supper describes the blood of the covenant. Then we have the story of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. Lots of interesting things there to talk about. And finally, this confession in chapter 15, verse 39, where the centurion says, truly this man was Son of God. At that point, then, we have Jesus' death. And then we have the burial and so on in the tomb. And we come to chapter 16 at the first day of the week, when the women come to anoint Jesus' body for burial. But surprise, the stone has been rolled away. And they go into the empty tomb, and there they see a young man clothed in white who says to them, he's not here. He's risen, just as he said. And he's go and tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before them into Galilee, just as he said. The women leave the tomb, run to tell the rest of the followers of Jesus that are gathered together that he is not here, he has been risen. And they say no one to anyone else before they've got to tell Jesus. got to tell the disciples. And that's where Mark's gospel ends. Now, many of your Bibles will have chapter 16, verses 9 to 22. These are verses which are not in the earliest recoverable manuscripts of Mark's gospel, but are in many manuscripts of a later provenance. Scholars have debated over this for years. Many have come to the conclusion that this was not part of what Mark wrote. I'm amongst those. Others, however, think that they are material that could have been written by Mark. Either way, these sections contain things that are present in other parts of the New Testament. So if you wish to look at them, you can actually see them in other parts of the New Testament. And that brings us to the time of saying, we've finished it. This whole book is brilliant in my view. It's inspired. It leads us to who Jesus is. And it challenges us to live as followers of Jesus, God's holy people, as we take up our cross on mission, on God's mission, on the mission inaugurated by Jesus to his world. May God bless you as you read this and think about it.